Nixon and the Watergate Scandal, 1972 to 1974. This will be a relatively brief overview of the scandal. This is one of these scandals that has so many twists and turns. There's so many players, there's so many documents and stories of money laundering and shenanigans going on behind the scenes. Again, there are so many books just simply about the Watergate scandal. They're still being published every year. So this is just going to be a quick overview to give you a sense of the basic facts about the Watergate scandal. But there's just know there are plenty more to learn about this. And for anybody who does know something about this already, you'll notice a lot of things that I'm already skipping. So the Watergate scandal is really all about two things, at least in its initial run. So number one, it's about an election. Nixon, like many presidents in his first term, is obsessed with winning a second term. Nixon, however, is probably more obsessed with winning than many other presidents have been. You couple that with his own insecurities, his paranoia, especially at his enemies. This is a volatile mix, and he again is just petrified in some ways that he's going to somehow lose this election. Um, and it's ironic because, as we've talked about in class already, he was doing quite well at this point. I mean, he had accomplished all these things. He was about the end of the Vietnam War. He had accomplished, great international achievements, and not surprisingly, I mean, he blows his opponent, McGovern, out of the water. I mean, this is one of the greatest landslides of all time. This map shows the electoral vote. Nixon literally gets the entire country except Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. George McGovern, his Democratic opponent, doesn't even get his home state of South Dakota. It is one of the biggest blowouts in American history. If you look at the popular vote, it's a little less, it's more of a 2-1. But from electoral vote, you almost can't win any bigger than this. Um, and it really does show that Nixon really didn't have that much to worry about. And if he hadn't to worry so much about this, we would not be doing this lecture right now. So the election of 72 is one part of this. The other part, and they're really tied together, is the Pentagon Papers, something we've already talked about. The scandal, Daniel Ellsberg releasing a hereby secret report that told the story of the Vietnam War, from Harry Truman up through Lyndon B. Johnson, released in 1971. So it technically did not deal with Nixon, but it did happen under Nixon's watch. Right off the bat, Nixon was furious about this because it is a government leak, and he's of course very concerned that this is going to happen again under his watch. And he does see the Pentagon Papers as even though it's not about him directly, he does see this as an attack on his policy towards the Vietnam War. And as we've talked about already, he is obsessed with Daniel Ellsberg. So he doesn't want any more leaks in this government, and he wants basically plumbers to plug up the leaks. And he's going to be using members of the CIA, ex-members of the CIA and FBI to do this. And the way they're going to fund this is the Committee for the Reelection of the President, the CRP, which is actually known in Nixon circles back then as CREEP. And of course, later that will feel appropriate to a lot of people during the Watergate scandal. So CREEP will be the ones using the funds, CREEP funds. So it's not government funds technically, will be used to pay these people to plug up leaks. Of course, they're going to do more than just plug up leaks. The Attorney General, of course, that is the top law officer for the nation. The Attorney General, John Mitchell, actually resigned from Attorney General in 1972 to run CREEP for his friend Richard Nixon. So CRP is run by the former top law official for the nation. There's quite an irony there. So Mitchell's the one that's partly gathering these guys together. So people like Howard Hunt, ex-CIA, also a novelist, G. Gordon Liddy, ex-FBI, James McCord, also ex-CIA. These are some of the plumbers. Now, again, Nixon wants to win desperately the 1972 election. He'll literally do anything. He wants a mandate. He wants the ability to do what politically he anything he wants to do. So when you're president and you win by a big margin, the idea is you now have a mandate. The public is behind you. And when you get reelected, you have even more power because it's like, look, not only did they vote me into office, they re-voted me into office. So he's willing to do anything to get that mandate. And of course, these plumbers know that. And so, and of course, these guys love Nixon. So they're not only doing, making sure there's no leaks in the government and leaks in the campaign, but they're also working for the campaign. I mean, they're doing what they call dirty tricks. In fact, another word for what they're doing is rat effing. This is going to be a term they're going to use. So they're doing all kinds of tricks, like releasing false stories about George McGovern. One of their dirty tricks was they sent out they literally stole letterhead from George McGovern's campaign. They wrote up a press release that George McGovern would have a press conference, and they sent it out to all the press. Said it's going to be on this date at this place. All the press shows up, and there's no George McGovern. It makes George McGovern look bad. These are the kinds of things these plumbers are doing. So at one point, White House counsel John Dean, and so this is the lawyer for the president, the official lawyer for the president. John Dean, of course, he knows Mitchell. And at one meeting in early 72, he meets with Mitchell and with the plumbers to talk about some of these ideas. In fact, this is, I'll go back to the slide for a minute. G. Gordon Liddy, he's kind of leading the meeting. Again, John Mitchell is also there. And Liddy lays out some plans. He says, we're going to break into the headquarters of the Democratic National Convention. We're going to get some records of these guys, and we're going to, and he starts laying out all these plans. And apparently Mitchell during the meeting kind of rolled his eyes a little bit at John Dean. John Dean apparently was uncomfortable with this. They finally said, look, it's too expensive. We really can't be doing this. Dean's kind of like, yeah, we can't be involved in this kind of stuff. They have a second meeting. Liddy comes back with some more plans. And by the way, one of the things that these plumbers had done earlier was they actually broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg. Remember, they're obsessed with him, into his psychiatrist's office, trying to look for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg at one point. Which, I mean, that not only is breaking and entering, but you're also violating HIPAA laws. I mean, this is, they don't find anything. They end up replacing the documents. So they've already been doing this kind of stuff. So to have another meeting, Liddy comes back. Dean again is like, guys, you can't be doing this. Now we don't have any real official records of these meetings. So, this is what Dean is saying later, Eventually Mitchell does approve a truncated plan by Liddy to go after the Democratic National Convention. So, and later that spring in 1972, they do indeed break into the Democratic National Headquarters, which is in the Watergate complex. We always say the Watergate Hotel. It's more than just a hotel. It is a whole complex. It is an office, a facility. There's, rental space. There's apartments. There is a hotel there. So it's when I was a kid, I always thought it was just a Holiday Inn. I always thought it was weird that everything was in this like Holiday Inn, but it's more than that, right? So this is where the Democratic National Headquarters are located in DC. And so they actually break in and they bug the place. They steal some records and they bug the place to try to get some dirt. And on June 17th, they're actually going back in to actually remove some of this stuff, which is kind of the irony. They're trying to undo what they've already done. And again, these are the guys that they get busted, because what ends up happening is a security guard named Frank Wills. I'm recording this in 2022. He just recently died. He's one of these guys that's been relatively forgotten about. But without Frank Wills, we wouldn't have any of this. So again, security guard at Watergate, he happened to notice that on one of the doors, there was some tape so that the door couldn't actually lock. In fact, we actually have his log that he kept. You can see June 17th, 72, Will's on duty. He sees, starts noticing some things that he sees that the locks have been stuffed with paper. It turns out the lights, called the police. And of course, the police come and capture these guys red-handed, literally red-handed in the Democratic National Headquarters. This is part of their dirty tricks, of course. So they are next day. They're arraigned in court. Their charge is breaking and entering, and there is a reporter there, a young reporter, late 20s, named Bob Woodward. He's the guy on the right there, working for the Washington Post, a local newspaper. It was not the paper quite yet. It was starting to become much more of a national paper, but this story, the Watergate scandal, is what's going to make the Washington Post a major newspaper. So Bob Woodward is in the courtroom. Again, no one else is paying attention to the story. And the judge calls them one by one. How do you plead? Who are you? And he hears people like, E. Howard Hunt, CIA, James McCord, ex-CIA, so-and-so, White House. And there's a White House lawyer there, not John Dean, but a lower level White House lawyer. And of course, Woodward is like, there's a story here. He writes it up. He eventually teams up with another young reporter, Carl Bernstein. What's interesting, these guys, they both work for the newspaper. They're very different. Bernstein leans left. He's a more Democrat. Bob Woodward leans more right. He's more of a Republican. Again, just night and day, and even the way they look, the way they act. Carl Bernstein is a brilliant writer. Bob Woodward is a brilliant reporter, researcher. Woodward had a lot of connections. Bernstein didn't even finish high school, but so he was not part of the elite. But yet they made a great team. And so again, throughout this scandal, it's going to be Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward reporting many of the stories. In fact, initially they're the only reporters covering this. Even their own newspaper, like, there's no story here. But slowly, we're not going to keep talking about them, but slowly they do begin to stay on the story. And suddenly, after a while, other newspapers and magazines, begin to chime in. But they are kind of credited with really sort of breaking this initial story, because if Bob Woodward hadn't been in their courtroom, this very well may have just disappeared. Again, this is one of their articles they're writing early on. Again, Bob Woodward notices James McCord, ex-CIA employee, so they write up an article the next day about what's going on, and this is literally their story here. So I had to check. I forgot to put a title. I was checking which video this is. Sorry about that. So, as some of you already know, there are tapes of conversations between President Nixon and his staff. Nobody knows about this yet. That will not be revealed for another year. But I'm going to go ahead and play you one of these tapes. So early on, there are two recordings of Nixon, the president of the United States, briefly talking about Watergate, what later becomes known as Watergate, this break-in. So the first one is actually, I believe, on the 20th of June. So 3 days after the break-in. And I'm not going to play that tape because, unfortunately, the important part of that tape is blank. Basically, Richard Nixon's talking to his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, and they start to talk about buggings and break-ins, and it goes blank for 18 minutes. And then when you hear the sound again, it's a 90-minute tape. When the sound comes back, they're talking about something else. We'll come back to that. But what we do have is the next conversation they have about this. And I think this is June 23rd. And this is actually going to be the last conversation, as far as we know, the last conversation that President Nixon will have on Watergate for about 9 months. So from Nixon's viewpoint, after the very beginning of this, he kind of quits paying attention to this story. He's running for re-election. This is 1972. He doesn't think this is a big deal. And it does bring up the issue of just how much does Nixon actually know about this. But as this tape is going to reveal, he knew something about it. This will become later known as the smoking gun tape. And let me go ahead and play it for you. I'll explain some of it after it's over with, because a lot of it's not going to make much sense to you. So let me go ahead and play it.
That's fine. Now, they have their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, the banker himself, and it goes some directions we don't want it to go. Also, there have been some things like an informant came in off the street to the FBI in Miami with there's a photographer who has a friend who's a photographer who develops films for this guy Parker, and the films had pictures of Democratic National Committee letterhead documents and things. So there's things like that that are filtering in. Mitchell came up with yesterday, and John Dean analyzed very carefully last night and concurs now with Mitchell's recommendation that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, in that the only network that paid any attention to last night was NBC, who did a massive story on the Cuban thing and all. But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is business here. We don't want you going any further. That's not an unusual development. And that would take care of it. Gray, he doesn't want to. Pat does want to. He doesn't know how to, and he doesn't have any basis for doing it. Given this, he will then have the basis. He'll call Mark Felt in, and the two of them, and Mark Felt wants to cooperate because he's ambitious. They'll call them in and say, we've gotten the signal across the river to put the hold on this. And that'll fit rather well because the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that's what it is a CIA. But they're tracing the money to, they've traced it to.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Nixon talks a little bit more later. That's Haldeman doing most of the talking there. So they mentioned the name Gray. At this point, Pat Gray was the acting FBI director. It had been J. Edgar Hoover. He had passed away. At this point, Pat Gray is again the acting FBI director. And they mentioned the name Mark Felt. And I want you to remember this name. It's going to come back later in this lecture. So Mark Felt had been the assistant director of the FBI under Hoover. And he had assumed that he is going to be the director after Hoover. In fact, you even heard in that conversation where Haldeman says, well, Mark Felt, he's ambitious, he's really wanting, and of course they don't say it completely, but they're like, Mark Felt wants to be director. He's going to help us out because he wants to be director. Mark Felt will not be made director. And that's another important point to keep in mind. Anyway, so what you're seeing here or hearing here is Haldeman saying, we're going to get the CIA. They're going to tell the FBI to quit investigating Watergate. I mean, this is only 6 days later, but already they're talking about tracing money and they're saying, and you got former Attorney General Mitchell involved, the current White House counsel, John Dean's already involved. And they're kind of like, yeah. Let's get the FBI to quit investigating this. And Nixon's going to make that call. I mean, that is evidence of a cover-up right there. Nixon clearly knows that he's not calling the police going, hey, I think I know who did this. We need to, he's actually telling the law officers, don't investigate. Now, FBI technically works for the president, but they are supposed to be independent. They are supposed to be able to investigate whatever they need to investigate. So this is a cover-up. That's why this is the smoking gun tape, even though it won't be known publicly for a long time. But this is going to be considered some of the evidence against Nixon to prove that even if he didn't do the break-in himself, he at least knew about it afterwards, and he was actively, willingly acting to cover it up. Okay, so again, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein will continue to report on this. And in fact, that's more what they're noticing. As they said, no, hardly anybody's covering this. It's not getting much steam, but these two guys are covering it. And this is the beginning of an era in American history where journalists were really kind of admired. I mean, we've already talked about other leaks and people like Seymour Hersh. And now you got Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. This is the golden era of the investigative journalist. Today, there's a lot of anger at the media, but this is a time when the media was starting to become kind of the watchdogs, if you will, for the public. Okay, so there's the break-in. There's an initial flurry of activity. Woodward and Bernstein are going to continue to cover this but again, their story is going to be on the back pages. Everybody thinks they're crazy, but they are slowly piecing together the puzzle. Now, we're not going to get into all that. It's fascinating, but it's too much detail. But they do start tracing money and figure out who knows who, and and of course they don't know about these conversations yet. These are not made public. So really nothing much happens. So 72 goes by. We have the election. Nixon's clearly reelected by a landslide. Then we get into the trial of the burglars. Because, again, it does take a while for this stuff to filter through. So late November through early January of 73, we are getting into the trial of the burglars. This is starting to be covered a little bit, but not a lot. The burglars are going to be found guilty. The judge in the case thinks that there's more here than they're letting on. And he keeps saying, I'm going to sentence you guys to the maximum sentence unless you reveal who your sources are and who's putting you up to this. We know it's not just you guys. There has to be some, he's really saying, we know the White House got him involved. So during the trial, kind of one person kind of emerges sort of as the ringleader. And he was the one coming up with these ideas. That's the guy named G. Gordon Liddy. He's very distinctive with that big mustache. He loved the press. He was very flamboyant, and kind of played this macho guy. I'm gonna take a bullet for the president. I'm not revealing anything. He will end up going to prison for a while, and then he does come out. He writes a book. He writes novels. He becomes a talk radio show host. He died just a few years ago, but he never backed down from his role. He thought, I did the right thing. I was helping the right president. No apologies here. This is him and his car tax has Watergate on it. He doesn't back off from this. But one of the other burglars does indeed crack. James McCord, also ex-CIA. He writes a letter to the judge in this case, Judge John Sirica, saying there are higher-ups involved. We even lied under oath because we were pressured to do so by higher-ups. It needs to be investigated. We are kind of the patsies here, if you will. John Sirica very publicly read it out loud in court. There's a lot of press coverage of this. Suddenly, what has seemed to have disappeared now comes roaring back as a major story, and it will not go away at this point. For the next year and a half, this is going to be the story in politics. At this point, Nixon's reelected. The campaign's over, and he kind of knows this. Not that he's going to get in big trouble, but he knows this is going to turn into something, and he's got to start dealing with it. This is not going away. So he meets with John Dean. Basically, he has told John Dean, or even before this meeting, John, you've been handling this. You know more about this than I do. You're my lawyer as president. So come up with a report. Tell me who's responsible. What do I need to do? He's basically saying, deal with this and make this go away, and so I can look good and we can just move on. John Dean's really involved in this, and he knows Nixon's involved in this, and that this is a big deal. And there's a lot of debate about John Dean. John Dean's still around. Again, we're in 2022. He's in the issues with Trump of the last few years, he's often the one the news agencies go to about his opinion. But there's always been debate about him. He was clearly involved. He always said that he got a conscience and he realized they were going wrong, and he turned it around. But other people think that he just kind of saved himself. There's a lot of debate over his actions. But anyway, so John Dean does not want to write a report. He knows he does not want to put this in writing. This is not good. And he later maintained that he always said that he didn't think Nixon knew just how bad this actually was. And so they met, and John Dean basically said, this is bad. At one point, he says, there is a cancer on the presidency. That's kind of a famous line from this meeting. But I'm going to play you a snippet of this conversation because it is recorded. We do have the tape of this conversation. And here we go.
Where are the soft spots on this? Well, first of all, there's the problem of the continued blackmail, which will not only go on now, it'll go on when these people are in prison,
and it will compound the obstruction of justice situation. It will cost money. It's dangerous. Nobody, the people around here are not pros at this sort of thing. This sort of thing mafia people can do. Washing money, getting clean money, and things like that. We just don't know about those things because we're not used. We're not criminals. We're not used to dealing in that business. It's a tough thing to know how to do. That's right. It's a real problem as to whether we can even do it. Plus, there's a real problem in raising money. Mitchell has been working on raising some money, feeling he's one of the ones with the most to lose. But there's no denying the fact that the White House and Ehrlichman, Hallam, and Dean are involved in some of the early money decisions. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years.
On the money, if you need the money, I mean, you can get the money.
Well, I think that's where.
What I mean is, you can get $1 million.
That was this is a really key moment. This is kind of the other major recording of Watergate. And John Dean, in fact, I'm going to play a tape of John Dean saying this. He was quite shocked at this because basically John Dean, he's basically saying, look, there's these guys that did something wrong. They're going to keep blackmailing us, which also implies that Nixon must have some other dirt that he's worried about these guys blackmailing us. But anyway, he's saying these guys are going to be a problem. We're going to have to pay these guys off if we keep trying to cover this up instead of, Dean is really trying to get Nixon to really just come out and just say, look, we screwed up and let's move on. And he just throws out the figure $1 million. Like, we're going to have to pay these guys $1 million to keep them quiet. And Nixon just says, yeah, we can get that. Yeah, that's no problem. I can get that. Meaning Nixon's willing to just get $1 million somehow and pay these guys off. I mean, that's the moment where it's very clear Nixon is not about to come clean on this. He is willing to pay real money to cover this up. And so as far as John Dean's concerned, this is the moment things really got real. Again, because of that letter by McCord, everybody knows this is getting lots of press. Congress is already having conversations about what are we going to do. And in May 1973, the Senate officially votes to hold hearings about Watergate. We're going to start investigating Watergate. Well, what is going on with this thing? It sounds like there's some people in the White House involved in this. So again, all of a sudden, this is getting very, very serious. So even before the Senate even officially votes on this, Nixon is trying to get a handle on this without having to admit any wrongdoing himself. So first thing he does is he actually fires several people. John Dean is the main one. If John Dean says that there's a cancer in the presidency, Nixon is going, well, you're the cancer. I'm cutting you out. Technically, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, chief of staff and White House aide, very close to Nixon. Up to this point, almost every recording of Nixon has one of these two guys in it. They were considered his Berlin Wall because they were both German Americans, so people called them the Berlin Wall. Nixon depended on these guys to protect him. They technically resigned, but it was not a friendly resignation. He basically is like, you guys are out of here. You guys are going to be the fall guys through this. You guys are involved in this. You guys, I'm clean. It's you guys that did this. So you got to get fired. He's hoping that this will clean it up. It kind of does the opposite. It makes people get very nervous now. Like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So this is the moment that this is clear. The public moment now, because again, these recordings, nobody knows about them, but this is the public moment that is clear. This is in for the long run. This is, by the way, quickly, this is an image of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein watching Nixon announcing the firing of Dean and the resignation of Haldeman Ehrlichman. And again, it's got to be an interesting thing. These guys, I think they're 28, 29 at this point. And suddenly they realize that their reporting is having effects on national politics. The most powerful man in the world is reacting to some degree to their stories. It's got to be kind of a cool moment, but probably kind of a scary moment because they also know they're going to be in the crosshairs. And we're not going to get into this, but some of the tapes do have Nixon talking about these two guys and saying, what are we going to do about these two guys? So Dean had already begun to, and this is where he was protecting himself. He was already starting to work with the law enforcement over Watergate even before he got fired. So now that he's fired, he is going to paint himself as, I'm the one that was trying to come clean, and Nixon was the one that kept us going. So here he is recounting the conversation we just heard, and it's interesting because now that we have the tapes, he doesn't. It's not a completely accurate recounting of some of that conversation. He is kind of, because he doesn't really think anybody's ever going to hear that conversation. Although during his testimony, he does hint that he thinks there might be tapes, because not everybody knows about these recordings. Ehrlichman and Haldeman didn't know about them. He didn't know about them. They wouldn't have said some of the things they said if they known there was a taping system involved.
As the president discussed the present status of the situation, I told him that all I'd been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House. I also told him that there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and that I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would not start to unravel. What I had hoped to do in this conversation was to have the president tell me we had to end the matter now. Accordingly, I gave considerable thought to how I would present this situation to the president and try to make as dramatic a presentation as I could to tell him how serious I thought the situation was that the cover-up continue. I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
The central question at this point is simply put, what did the president know, and when did he know it?
Now, the last bit obviously wasn't John Dean, but that question, it gets repeated all the time nowadays. We say it all the time when we have scandals. What did he know, and when did he know it? And this question keeps getting asked about Nixon throughout the rest of the Watergate scandal. Like, well, when did he know stuff? Anyway, so you can see Dean is cooperating here. So Nixon has to, he's got to get some new people in here, and he's got to try to make it look like he's being proactive and that he's going to fix everything. So, John Mitchell had resigned. There had been an acting attorney general, but Nixon waited till after the election before he appointed his permanent attorney general, and he does with Attorney General Elliot Richardson. He's not going to last long. So this is, again, the new law officer. Again, Nixon's like, got a clean slate, got a new guy, none of that Mitchell guy anymore. We're going to have a good guy in here now that's going to do the right thing. And since Congress is investigating, Nixon's like, well, I'm going to have my own special investigation over Watergate. We're going to get to the bottom of this matter. And he appoints Archibald Cox to do the White House investigation of Watergate. But deep down, Nixon also thinks he can control both of these guys. Like they're working for him. And that's not going to be the case. So that summer, this is the first time that the public and Congress learns that there are indeed recordings of White House conversations. And of course, everybody wants to know, well, we got to hear these conversations. What did they say? So the way this gets revealed, again, Dean had already hinted in his testimony that he thinks conversations are being recorded. And other people in Congress are getting this sense. People are like, yeah, Nixon recounted this conversation exactly, and I don't know how he would do, and so there's kind of a growing sense. Now, let me go back for a second. So Nixon came into the White House in 1969. Johnson had a lot of, he had his telephone mic'd so he could record his phone conversations. Nixon had those removed. A couple of years into the presidency, J. Edgar Hoover suggested to Nixon that he actually tape his conversations to keep track of what he's saying and might help him with his memoirs once he's done being president. And Nixon takes his advice and does indeed bug the White House. This is one of the machines they used. Of course, they had microphones placed throughout the Oval Office and actually a couple other facilities. But on this one diagram, you can see anything that says M, that means mic. So mic 1, mic 2. So you can see the point. You can see what I'm pointing at. Sorry. You can see the president's desk towards the top. So there's already 5 mics right there. So you can capture anybody sitting in any of the chairs or standing. But also notice at the bottom of the Oval, again, this is the Oval Office. You can see other mics And these are all going to be voice activated to the point. In fact, and again, this is a photograph of the Oval Office. So again, where the fireplace is under George Washington, there's some mics in case people are sitting in those chairs, but there's 5 mics all around the president's desk. So anybody's talking, they can pretty much capture. And again, these are going to be voice activated. So it kind of gets to the point that people forget they're, Nixon's going to forget they're there. And almost nobody knows about Nixon puts these in place. The Secret Service actually installed the mics. Secret Service and some other government officials are in charge of changing out the tapes and keeping logs of the tapes, but it's very secret. So there are some people who know about it, but most of the people in the Oval Office don't know this is happening. This is for Nixon. Now, this is all publicly funded. This is all government property, but Nixon's going to consider these his private tapes. These were never meant to be public. These were only for his use. That's, So during these congressional hearings, they get a sense that there are tapes. So they're constantly asking people during their testimony, do you know of any recording devices in the White House? Do you know of any taping systems? And they ever says, no, I don't know about that. Alexander Butterfield, who was not really involved with Watergate at all. He just happened to be a White House aide, but he knew about the taping system. He did have knowledge of it. And by the way, he's still around. I mean, in 2022, he's 96, and he is one of the last of the Watergate people still around, along with John Dean. So he knew about it, and they asked him. In fact, a senator named Fred Thompson, who later became an actor, asked him, do you know about the taping system? And he says, yes, I know about the tape. There are tapes of conversations. Suddenly the press can't believe it. They're like, oh my God, there's tapes. The White House is bugged. Not only did they try to bug the Democratic National Office, they bugged their own White House. So of course, people are starting to write dates. Hey, we want conversations right after June 17th. We want conversations in July of 72. We want conversations, before you find, people are starting to like, we want tapes of these, who has these tapes? How can we get a hold of them? So the rest of 73 and into 74, it is going to be a massive battle between Nixon, who claims these are his private tapes, and both Congress and the Supreme Court. I mean, this goes all the way to the Supreme Court saying, no, these are public record. And this is a criminal investigation. If we subpoena these tapes, you have to provide them. This is when something I mentioned earlier comes up. So again, they're saying, hey, look, we have he does turn over some of, they are giving some of the info, but not all of it. They're like, hey, we see there's a tape from June 20th where you're talking about things. We want that tape. And Nixon's administration says, well, the problem with that tape is, unfortunately, the part that talks about Watergate is it's blank. For 18 and a half minutes, there's no sound. Well, how can there be no sound? There's sound before, there's sound afterwards. It's a 90-minute conversation. Well, Nixon's secretary took the blame. Rose Marie said that as she was working the equipment, she did accidentally hit a button that turned on the tape recorder that then erased the tape. Now she's showing how this happened, and the press were like not buying it. It was clear that it wasn't something you accidentally did. In fact, even once they got a hold of this tape, it was very clear that this was not an accident. I don't know if you guys have ever dealt with audio tape, but when you have audio tape and you re-record over it, there's always ghost traces of the previous recording. So, so to really record, you have to erase them, you have to record it over and over and over. So they were able to figure out, even back then, and it's been confirmed digitally today, that at least 7 machines were involved. In other words, at least 7 different machines went over this tape. You play the tape, you hit record, you say nothing, you reverse it, hit record again. I will say that even just recently, they have tried, the National Archives has tried to recover any data, and there have not been able to. We're probably never going to know exactly what was discussed on that 18-minute gap. But in a weird way, the 18-minute gap, it's probably worse than whatever they said, because we can fill in the blanks. And again, this is starting to really look like a cover. This is getting worse and worse and worse. Congress wants those tapes. And they're going to go to the Supreme Court to get those tapes. So some of these tapes, I had to wait till I forgot which one this was. So some of these tapes are quite interesting. I've played a few of these in class already, but I want to play one more. This has kind of recently come out. Again, one of the most fascinating things about these tapes, again, is a lot of the kind of nonchalant conversation that happens. You know, you hear people talk about TV shows or talking about gossip or telling jokes to each other. One of the tapes that comes out is that people are now listening to today is there was a brand new senator named Joseph Biden whose wife and child were killed in a car crash. And Nixon is told about this. And of course, he's president. He's going to call Joe Biden up. So this is a quick version of this tape.
Yes, please.
Could you get the new senator from Delaware, Mr. Biden, on the phone, please?
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you? Senator, I know this is a very tragic day for you, but I wanted you to know that all of us here at the White House were thinking about you and praying for you, and also for your two children. And appreciate that very much. We know that I understand you were on the Hill at the time, and your wife was just driving by herself.
Yes, that's good.
But in any event, I mean, looking at it as you must in terms of the future, because you have the great fortune of being young. I remember I was 2 years older than you, and I went to the House. But the main part is you can remember that she was there when you won a great victory, and you enjoyed it together, and now I'm sure that she'll be watching you from now on.
I'll go ahead and stop it there. I know it's kind of doesn't quite fit the lecture, but I wanted to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of things that these tapes continue beyond just Watergate. It's actually kind of a sweet, sad but sweet tape. I mean, you know, Nixon is trying to do good, and he's, you know, but it also reveals, I think, Nixon's awkwardness. He literally doesn't know what to say, and he just reverts to politics. He's like, well, you got a future, and you won the House, don't, you know, and it's just, you can just feel he doesn't literally know what to say, but it is a sweet thing. He is trying to do the right thing here. And again, a lot of these tapes have become more significant, you know, because of some of the people involved in these after the fact. Anyway, I mean, these tapes are a treasure trove for historians. I mean, they're imperfect, they can be frustrating, but they are a treasure trove. But at the time, Nixon knows that they are dynamite. These tapes could and will sink him. So Nixon is fighting anybody to get a hold of these tapes. And again, they want the actual tapes. So he makes a compromise. In early 1974, he says, I will give you transcripts of the tapes. I will have my people go through the tapes and type them up of certain recordings. I'm not going to, you know, we got private conversations here. You don't need to hear that. But we'll let you, you know, the important stuff, and we'll transcribe it to you, and we'll give you the transcripts. Again, edited versions of these. What's interesting is not only they edited because they only take the parts, the important parts, but of course they get to choose what are the important parts. But he also is going to edit his own language. Now that tape I just played you was quite nice, but he uses a lot of language, a lot of dams and hells and GDs and worse language, a lot of racial language, a lot of homophobic language, you know. So as he's editing these, they use the term expletive deleted. And it's kind of like you ever seen when comedians take a clip of something innocent and they put bleeps in and it makes it sound like it's really dirty. That's pretty much what happens here. And of course, cartoonists had a field day um, with the whole expletive deleted aspect of the transcript. So they are published. He sends them out, says, "This is, there you go, look at it." And of course, they get published by the Washington Post and others because these now become official public record. But again, they're just a snippet of the full tapes. Congress is like, no, we want all of these. So that this is going to continue to be a battle. Okay, to back up a little bit. So in October 1973, I'm sorry, it says 74 there, but in 1973, Nixon fires the brand new attorney general. So again, this is 1973, not 74. And he fires Archibald Cox, the White House investigator, because they're revealing too much, because they're not cooperating with Nixon. It's called the Saturday Night Massacre. And I know I've said this about a few things, but this, again, is another one of those ratcheting up moments. People are like, oh my God. I mean, he's already fired some people. Now he's firing the people that are supposed to be cleaning up everything. There's tapes. Who knows what's on those tapes? There's tapes with missing, that's been erased, missing material. Now he's firing people. I mean, he is looking like a crook. And there is a lot of debate. I mean, even a lot of his supporters are like, maybe this guy is guilty of something. So again, the Saturday Night Massacre is a big turning point in the Watergate scandal, another major turning point. And this is actually a cover from the summer, but again, people are beginning to ask, well, what does Nixon know, and when does he know it? Nixon realizes he's got a real problem on his hands. Just literally almost exactly a year after winning the greatest landslide in American history, he's now being seen as a crook. So this is from a press conference, actually in Orlando, Florida, at a hotel at Disney World. And he's talking to the press, and he says probably the most famous line that Nixon would ever say.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. President? Yes.
And again, it was interesting. He's focusing on I don't make any money, but that's not what people are saying. I mean, he's not really addressing the Watergate part, right? And it's interesting because, as you may remember from previous lectures, I mean, Nixon has gotten in trouble before. There was a money scandal way back in 1952 when he was running with Eisenhower as vice president, and he gave a speech, the Checker speech, and he got out of that scandal. He's been able to get out of other scandals by using the press and speech, but this time it doesn't seem to be working. That moment that I'm not a crook, that becomes sort of the line. If anybody's ever imitating Nixon, that's what they always say. I'm not a crook, And of course, it's almost like saying, like, I'm honest Dave, buy a car from me. If I have to tell everybody I'm honest, I'm probably not honest. So this really kind of drove home the suspicion that maybe Nixon really is a crook. By this point, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward have written their book, All the President's Men. So basically, they've written an account of how they broke the story, because now everybody's covering this. But they broke, it is a fascinating read, by the way. I actually love this book. And it does give you a sense of how good journalism is done, especially in an age before digital era where you really did have to just dozens and dozens of calls all day. So I do highly recommend it if you ever get a chance to read it. It's very well written. But this is the first time the public really are getting to kind of put everything together, because, up to now, it's just been, one news report and then another. And remember, there's no internet. So you read the newspaper, you watch the news on TV, and then it's done. It's not like today where you can Google stuff and see all the reports all at once. I mean, it was just kind of a drip, drip, drip of stories. And it's easy to get mixed up and even forget things. But when this book came out, I mean, this was a bestseller. People are like, oh my God, oh yeah, that's right. That guy said this and this guy said that. And, So this became, must reading in 73 and 74. And one of the things in it is that Bob Woodward reveals that he does have a secret source, somebody that is giving him information, at least giving him hints. And he doesn't reveal who it is. Bob Woodward would not reveal who it was until the 2000s. Basically, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein said they would never reveal their source. And it was Bob Woodward's source, turned out to be somebody he knew even before Watergate. And then during Watergate, he would ask him questions and get confirmation of things, that they would not reveal this source. And the only people who knew about it was Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, and the editor, Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, and I think Martha Graham, the owner of Washington Post. Those were the only four people who knew who this person was for years. But Bob Woodward in the book says, well, we had to refer to him in some way. So whenever we talked about him, we called him Deep Throat. So Deep Throat, as in he's talking, you talk with your throat. He's in deep background. And again, if you don't know already, Deep Throat was the name of a movie from 1972, filmed down in Florida. Was kind of considered the first sort of mainstream hardcore pornography film. There had been pornography before, but this was, the real stuff. And it didn't play mainstream theaters. Some people say that is not true, but it was a big hit. And it did, people talked about the star, Linda Lovelace. She used to be on Tonight Show for a while, later, in another lecture, we'll talk a little bit about this whole phenomena of porn chic as it became known. So, but just keep in mind, already, even before this book comes out, people knew what Deep Throat was. They knew what the movie was, even if they hadn't seen it. And then now the name Deep Throat is now being reported in newspapers and on the news as this secret source for Bob Woodward. And I will say that the person, and I'll tell you who it was later, the person, and if you've been paying attention, you can figure out who it was, by the way. If we were in class, I'd ask if anybody knows who it is at this point. But the person who it was furious when they read that this is what their nickname. They were not happy that this was their nickname. Okay. So with the book, with the transcripts, with the missing tapes, with the firings, I mean, the Nixon presidency is ruined at this point. He's pretty much never going to come back from this completely. It has tarnished his presidency. Again, coming from this massive high, almost immediately, he is crashing. And again, this is going on for months and months, but this is pretty grinding the White House to a halt practically. Summer of 1974, again, there's more investigations by Congress. There's more revelations in the press. Again, the book's already out. And in July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court of the United States orders Nixon he has to release the tape. Now, we don't mean that the public's going to hear all these tapes, but he has to turn these tapes over to Congress. They are not his property. They are government's property. They're public record. And not only that, but this is a subpoena. This is a criminal investigation. He's got to turn them over. And he does, very reluctantly, but he does. There has always been rumors that he didn't turn over all the tapes, that he burned tapes, that he got rid of tapes. The night before he turned them over, there are reports of him just listening to these tapes over and over and trying to figure out. But he does turn the tapes over. And again, for historians, we're so thrilled that he did that because we have all these recordings now. It's really over at this point. You cannot survive these tapes. And I haven't even played you some of the worst ones, but even the two tapes of John Dean and the earlier smoking gun tape, that's enough to get to ruin the presidency. And those are public. So in late July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee recommends impeachment. And remember, impeachment is not removal from office. Impeachment is charging the president with a crime. The House impeaches, and then the Senate will hold the trial. And if he's found guilty, then they will remove him from office. So the House Judiciary Committee has said, yes, he should be impeached. They actually were talking about 5 articles. One of them has to do with tax issues. I think it had to do with money laundering and creep. One of them dealt with the bombing of Cambodia. Those were rejected. It was seen as those aren't really the focus here, but abuse of presidential power, contempt of Congress, and in particular, obstruction of justice, which clearly those tapes, without a doubt, number 3 is clearly there. There's no doubt. And really the others are there as well. So he's about to get impeached. He's about to get charged with a crime. He'll be the only, at this point, the second president to be impeached. So it's in the House. They're getting ready to have the vote to whether or not to impeach him. At this point, on August 7th, 1974, the top Republicans in the party meet with Nixon in the White House. This is them after their meeting. Senator Hugh Scott, Senator Barry Goldwater, and Representative John Rhodes, all of the Republican Party, they have met with Nixon, and they tell him flat out, you are going to get impeached. There's no doubt. And when it comes to the Senate, we're all going to vote guilty. You are guilty of this. For the not just the good of the Republican Party, but for the good of the nation, you have to resign. We do not need this. This is not good. You have to walk away. Nixon knows it's over. He does indeed know it's over. There are reports of his last hours in the White House. There are some recordings of him even before this point, talking to people. He's been drinking a lot at this point. There are previous conversations where he actually breaks down crying. He kind of knows this is coming. This last night, Henry Kissinger later described seeing Nixon at one point literally laying on the ground in the fetal position crying. He just cannot believe. It's so Shakespearean, this person who's at the height of power, but because of his own personal flaws, is ruined. I mean, it is literally a Shakespeare tragedy in many ways. But he does make the decision to resign. He doesn't really have a choice at this point. And he does announce his resignation the next day.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation.
So he's doing something that nobody thought they'd ever hear before, and we haven't heard it since, and that is a president resigning from office. You can see the emotion. You can see he's a little unsure, but it is so Nixon. He does, because notice one thing he doesn't do. He admits no wrong. He makes no apology. And in fact, the way he says is like, I'm trying to get my job done, but apparently Congress doesn't want me to do it. My family wants me to stay, but I guess I'll leave. Nobody seems to want me here anymore. He's still kind of pushing it off, like I would do the job, but no one's let me do it. So again, it is very Nixon in many ways, and that lack of an apology, that lack of taking the blame, is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. I do want to play one other tale. I can just play some of this. This is the actual full recording. I think it's like 20-something minutes. But what's more interesting is his last talk to the White House staff. He was very well liked by the White House staff. You know, privately, apparently he was a nice guy. And I mean, he had tempers, he drank a lot, but at the same time, people did like him in the White House. And this is him with his family talking to the White House staff. This was not necessarily meant to be sort of a public thing, but there is a recording of it. And you can really see, I'm just gonna play a little bit, but he does get very emotional.
We think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as TR said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes, and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
Anyway, so there's this little slightly different side of Nixon than the one we saw in the resignation letter, and what we'll see in a few moments. So he has resigned from office, and this is kind of the other, I think, classic image of Nixon: the "I'm not a crook" line and the double V for victory. So, and this was seen as, again, yet another sign of Nixon's awkwardness, his just kind of just his strangeness a little bit in the way he behaved. So he's walking out to the helicopter to take him away for the last time. Like he's walking away from the White House, right? And again, Nixon's trying to, his whole thing is, I've done nothing wrong. They want me to leave office, so I'm going to leave office. But he's trying to maintain this, like, okay, I did nothing wrong, though. It's you guys. So he's walking to the helicopter, he's getting on, and he just decides to turn around, and instead of crying or being mad, he just says, a big smile, and and it's just so awkward. You can see the headline here: Nixon's defiant farewell. And so again, most people who imitate Nixon will always do the double V for victory and then shake their head and go, "I'm not a crook." And so that's where that comes from. So again, it was just seen as just kind of an awkward thing to do, but that's a classic image of Nixon there. Okay, so we'll get into his replacement and the White House after this, but let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Watergate for a moment. So that book, All the President's Men, by the way, they did write a sequel to it called The Final Days, which is also a really interesting read that really does get into those last details of the White House. But All the President's Men is the book to read, and it was made into a movie in 1976. And I'm not going to lie, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's, to me, the ultimate 70s film, with Robert Redford, producer, and starring Bob Woodward and Dustin Hoffman as Carl Bernstein. And I do actually think it's an excellent film just for the sake of a movie. It is fictionalized, but it actually gives you a pretty good idea of the look and feel of the time period. I actually lived as a little kid in DC. My dad was a Marine station up there. And I'll tell you, I mean, it does look like what I remember even as a little kid. But they actually did a really good job of recreating a lot of the time. So I do, even as a historian, I do recommend it if you get a chance to watch it. I'm going to skip the trailer for today because of time. I know it's running long. So look up the trailer at some point. So again, but the movie stops before the resignation, but the movie very much is telling the story from the viewpoint of the reporters, because there kind of isn't the Nixon viewpoint. Now remember, the tapes, other than snippets, the tapes aren't available yet. You couldn't do back then what I can do today and play all these tapes, all of these tens, thousands hours of tapes, So Nixon goes away and he kind of disappears. He starts making speeches. He doesn't talk about Watergate. To make money, but Nixon's, as far as Watergate's concerned, mum. You're not hearing anything. No apology, no explanation, nothing. Finally, a person named David Frost. He was a TV personality in Britain in the 60s, had kind of a satirical news show called That Was the Week That Was. Actually, some of the guys from Monty Python, like John Cleese, are on the show because it's a very popular show in the 60s. David, it's kind of like the Daily Show today, Jon Stewart or somebody like that. But Frost kind of ended up becoming like a real media person. He becomes an interviewer, and he actually becomes quite respected as a journalist to some degree. Still a celebrity, but and David Frost, one day got realizing like there's a story here. If I could convince Nixon to sit down and have an interview, we could make millions. So he manages to get some funding. He approaches Nixon's people and says, "Look, I'll pay you close to $1 million to sit down and do 3 interviews, 2 hours each, and you have to talk about Watergate, and we can sell this to the networks and make a lot of money, and plus the public are dying for you to talk about this." And Nixon agrees. He wants to get paid up front. He cashes the check immediately. Frost didn't know who he was dealing with. Nixon initially, they sit down for the first interview, and Nixon does an old politician's trick. Frost asks the question, and the way they divide it, like one was going to be about domestic policy, one session was going to be about foreign policy, and the other session was going to be Watergate. So I think it's the international section. And Frost asks the question, and Nixon proceeds to talk pretty much for 2 hours. And he just runs out the clock. And Frost is like, "Oh, we're in trouble. This guy knows how to get out of, So they do talk to Nixon and say, "Look, you have to talk about Watergate." So finally, they do have the session where they talk about Watergate. And I'm going to play you 3 quick clips from this interview. It is the only time Nixon's going to talk about Watergate. The first clip is literally just seconds. And this is just part of the conversation in this one interview.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
So again, when the president does it, this means it is not illegal. It's an incredibly revealing statement. And I think Nixon means it. I think in his mind, he really thinks he didn't do anything wrong. I think a lot of presidents think this way. Well, I'm president. I'm here for the good of the country. If I think something needs to be done, it's the right thing to do,
Or when the president does it.
Sorry. So the interview progresses, and Nixon is ready. He's going to start talking about Watergate a little bit.
It was my fault. I'm not blaming anybody else. I'm simply saying to you that as far as I'm concerned, I not only regret it, I indicated my own beliefs in this matter. When I resigned, people didn't think it was enough to admit mistakes, fine. If they want me to get down and grovel on the floor, no, never.
So he does kind of say it's my fault, but throughout the interview, he does keep pushing on other people. But again, that defiant, they want me to apologize, never, Frost does push him a little bit further. And in this clip, he's talking about having a conversation with his wife. So here we go. And you can see he's very emotional in this clip.
I'm sorry. I just hope I haven't let you down. Well, when I said, I just hope I haven't let you down, that said it all. I had. I let down my friends. I let down the country. I let down our system of government and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but will think it's all too corrupt and the rest. Most of all, I let down an opportunity that I would have had for 2.5 more years to proceed on great projects and programs for building a lasting peace, which has been my dream, as you know, from our first interview in 1968, before I had any thought I might even win that year. I didn't tell you I didn't think I might win.
Again, there's a brief moment where you can see he's emotional. He is, he's talking to his wife, and and he says to her, "I'm sorry. I let you down. And then he's for just a second, he's like, I did let people down, I let the country down. But then in that politician way, and that, maybe I should just say that Nixon way, he turns it where he's the victim. It's like, I let you down, and I let everybody down because I could have been a great president. I could have done amazing things if I hadn't, it's like it's still kind of about, he's still bitter that he wasn't allowed to be president, that he really could have done great things. And it's almost like it's not really his fault. So, but this is it. This is the last time Nixon's ever going to talk about this. And it's the closest thing that he says to sorry. I mean, he does technically say, I'm sorry. And that's the headline. But again, when you really listen to it, it's still not quite there. And that's it. That's all we're ever going to get from Nixon. No explanation why, no nothing. Just that's it. That's as close as we're going to get. There has been a couple of books about these interviews. There was a play that came out back in the 2000s that then was turned into a pretty good movie. It's not very accurate, but it's a fun movie, and I do recommend it, even though it does fictionalize a lot of stuff, but it does give you a sense of the battle between these guys. So that's one lingering issue, and that's as far as we can go with that, because Nixon died in, I think, 94, and he never had another conversation about it. The other mystery of this whole thing, and when I first lectured on this about 10, 11 years ago, this was still unknown, and that is, who was Deep Throat? This is Hal Holbrook, the actor from the movie All the President's Men. This is what, even to this day, if you say something about Deep Throat from Watergate, this is actually what I think of. In fact, I'll play you one of the clips of Hal Holbrook playing, at that point, a character that nobody knew who he was. And in real life, Bob Woodward did meet with Deep Throat in a parking garage, and they would have conversations there.
Slip away. Yes. You've done worse than let Haldeman slip away, get people feeling sorry for him. I didn't think that was possible. In a conspiracy like this, you build from the outer edges and you go step by step. If you shoot too high and miss, everybody feels more secure. You put the investigation back months.
Yes, we know that. And if we're wrong, we're resigning. Were we wrong?
You'll have to find that out, won't you?
Listen, I'm tired of your chicken shit games. I don't want hints. I need to know what you know.
It was a Haldeman operation. The whole business was run by Haldeman. The money.
Okay, stop there. I think there's 3 scenes with Deep Throat in the movie, and again, it's Hal Holbrook, but he actually won an Oscar for this, but you never actually see him much. And again, in the movie, it's really dramatic, and it's a great movie. But again, these scenes are definitely more fictionalized because Bob Woodward wasn't able to really say what the conversations completely were, because that would reveal who this person was. So there's always been speculation. Who was Deep Throat? My own personal thought, and I was wrong, with the guy on the right, a guy named Al Haig, General Al Haig. You've actually heard him in this class because he's the guy who told Nixon when the Pentagon Papers were released. He worked for Nixon. Later would be Secretary of State under Reagan, and we will be talking about Al Haig again in this class. But when Al Haig died, nothing. So I was like, wasn't him. Most people thought that it was Henry Kissinger, the guy on the left, who was National Security Advisor for Nixon, then later was Secretary of State for Nixon and for the next guy, Gerald Ford. He's still around as of 2022. He is still around. I think he's in his 90s now, still writing books. And, that was my second choice and what most people's first choice was, but it wasn't him either. And there's been always a lot of rumors of who else it could have been. It was a guy named Mark Felt, who we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the assistant director of the FBI, who was then passed over to be the full-time director. He was furious about this. He also was furious, as were many in law enforcement, of Nixon's abuse of power. Basically, remember, he told the FBI to back off this investigation. Presidents are not supposed to have that kind of control over the FBI, but Nixon exerted it. So he's personally angry at Nixon. He's also professionally angry at Nixon. And he knows the secrets. He's FBI. He knows about the taping system. He knows what's going on. He knew Bob Woodward. He had met Bob Woodward at a party. Bob Woodward was big in the Republican Party as a young man, and he had connections. So they knew each other already. And during the beginning of Watergate, Bob Woodward calls in a favor and says, "Hey, Mr. Felt, you told me to call you if I ever need anything. What do you know about Watergate?" And Felt agreed to meet with it. They had this whole secret system. The movie actually does a good job of showing how this worked, and there was all these secret ways they would meet. And basically Felt wouldn't tell him everything. He would give him hints. The movie, again, talks about some of the accurate conversations, but a lot of it has to be fictionalized. Since we now know it's Mark Felt, Bob Woodward has gone back and rewritten a short version of the book that basically just says, this is the stuff I couldn't tell you. When this first came out, I remember thinking, what? Mark Fell? I was so disappointed. But it makes complete sense the more you think about it. In fact, it was kind of there in plain view. People had, there's even a record of Nixon wondering if Mark Felt was Deep Throat. And this is from 1974 from Fort Lauderdale News. And Mark Felt kind of wanted to tell everybody. Here he's basically saying, no, I'm not Deep Throat. I don't know what you're talking about. People think it could have been me, but no, it wasn't me. And in later interviews, he practically tells people it's him, but nobody really paid attention. Now that we know, it's fascinating to kind of go back and see all his interviews, how pretty much he was like, what, me as Deep Throat? Nah, can't be me. So why did he finally come out? Because again, Woodward and Bernstein said they would never reveal it until the person died or they came out themselves. Mark Felt within his 90s by this point. He was starting to lose his memory. He's also at the end of his life. And he and his family, I think it's more his family, basically said, we want to be the ones to announce it. And plus he could kind of enjoy the glory of this, if you will. So again, he does come out, and it is this weird situation where you have this 91-year-old guy going, I'm Deep Throat, but he does reveal it, and then that allows Bernstein and Woodward to actually then talk about the connection with Mark Felt. There's a movie about him. I don't recommend it, even though Liam Neeson does look a little bit like him. And by the way, actually, Hal Holbrook looks a lot like him. I've always wondered, did they kind of know maybe if that, the casting is pretty perfect, it turns out. So I have always wondered if Woodward didn't tell the filmmakers, but I don't think that's true. And with that, we're finally done with Watergate. It felt like it lasted about as long as Watergate. But again, we've had technically 3 presidents impeached: Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, and Nixon was almost impeached. But really, Nixon began sort of what some historians have begun to call the age of impeachments. All the impeachments that we've had have all been purely political. I would argue that all 3 of them are guilty of what they were accused of. Johnson did break a law, although it was a law passed to get him in trouble. Clinton did indeed lie under oath about his sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and Donald Trump was trying to get dirt on Joe Biden. That was the first thing, with Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, that was the first one he was impeached for. And he does seem to have perhaps been leading the January 6th thing. But in all these cases, the evidence wasn't quite there. And in the first 2 cases, they weren't important enough to actually remove a president from office. And in Donald Trump's case, the evidence just wasn't there. The evidence just wasn't there. And again, all of these were done for more political reasons than for national reasons, if that makes sense. And as I said in class, it does seem to be, and this starts with Nixon, it does seem to be, this has become kind of a political tool that one party wields against the other party. And both parties are both guilty of this. It is not one side or another. But again, with Nixon, we kind of have entered the age of impeachment, and it does seem that it's kind of ratcheting up. It seems like they're happening quicker and quicker and quicker, and who knows where this is going to take us. But anyway, that's it. We're finally done. Thank you, guys.